Good morning, everyone. How is everyone? I need to make sure that I check my clock. My name is Nectarios. I'm talking here about mental health and entrepreneurship. I kind of need to establish my credibility with you, so I'll talk a little bit about myself. But also, just to set the tone, over the last about 18 months, I've been slowly realizing that I have some experiences and some behaviors that would probably fall into the neurodiversity spectrum. And I'll tell you a very simple example of what happened just now at the back. I'm normally used to talking, moving around, holding a microphone, maybe having a clip-on mic, and maybe a clicker. And somebody gave me this iPad and said, oh, this is where the questions will come up later. And suddenly I was holding two things, and for a moment, my brain went into freeze. What am I going to do now? I have to hold two things. Simple things like that made me a little bit jittery. So the iPad's away, I'm calm. I'm Greek, born in Germany, live in London, spent most of my life, the first 20 years of my adult life in corporate, and then I moved into startups. It was a gradual transition, but at some point I found myself co-founding the first global startup competition, and what became at some point the world's largest startup accelerator for fintech companies. So we were working with early stage founders, very hands-on for 3 months, very intense, and we tried to create this pressure that you created in an accelerator, because that was the story 10 years ago. And what we didn't realize is that startup life is hard anyway. And when you come into this, especially as a first-time founder, you're not really equipped to deal with most of these things. And then creating this additional pressure. So we became part of the problem, but I only realized this when I walked away from all of this 5 years later, because I was completely burnt out. In 2019, I had a coffee with a good friend of mine who came from the VC world, and we decided we want to do something about it, and we created the Future Farm. The Future Farm is a non-commercial initiative. It's a platform that is built to create awareness on the subject of mental health and entrepreneurship and advocate for better ways of managing that. Preventing rather than fixing. But let's talk some numbers, just to give context to this. Pretty much a third of the global population, adult population, at some point experiences some sort of mental health struggle. It could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be different things, and they're very personal. But if you look at the entrepreneurial world, that number goes from about a third to about 3/4. Right? It's quite staggering. And on top of that, there's been all sorts of different numbers being bandied about, but it costs about $1 trillion a year to the global economy, managing just depression and anxiety in the workforce. Some more numbers. As an entrepreneur, you're twice more likely to experience depression, you're twice more likely to experience suicidal ideation, and you're 3 times more likely to engage in substance abuse. Now, you see some numbers here. When we started this 5 years ago, we couldn't get hold of any numbers. There was one global study that was done in 2015, and that was really it. The researcher that did this, Dr. Michael Freeman, he still struggles to find people to peer review his findings so he can publish them. There's a wonderful researcher in the UK called Ute Stephan who's done some recent work that she's about to publish. And she gave us something that I want to put into the room to lead a little bit to explain what's actually happening. Entrepreneurs are a particular type of animal. They're building something because there's an intrinsic build to build, and at the same time, they found fulfillment and motivation in what they're building, right? In parallel, startup life is stressful. And unlike the normal population, entrepreneurs are able to manage both at the same time. If you are employed, the moment things get stressful, your motivation drops. If you're an entrepreneur, you can work yourself to death and still go, oh my God, this is amazing, I'm so fulfilled. And this is part of the reason why we're talking about what we're talking today. But let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening when we talk about mental health. I'm going to break it down in 2 different parts. External triggers and what people are experiencing. When you build a business, and we're focusing here on tech startups of any nature, but that's reality for the majority of businesses, You're constantly dealing with financial concerns, right? Raising money, making payroll, finding the next client, that's a given. The moment you raise external money, then you have additional investor pressures. And people are not as vocal about this publicly, but the moment you sit down with the founder and goes, how's your relationship with your VC? You get the dirt. And it's shocking to see what's going on in these relationships sometimes. One of the biggest reasons why startups fail is co-founder conflict. Often, especially first-time founders, you start a business because you're doing this with a mate, you have a great idea, you start playing around with it. None of you has actually ever built a business, none of you has ever managed, and suddenly you have to hire people, you have to think about all these other things, you may have raised some money, and you look at each other and go, we actually don't get on. We try to sweep it under the carpet, and by the way, I'm just looking at the room, and just so for those of you who look this way, I see so many heads nodding. It's fascinating. Nobody in our educational system, in our home life, is actually being brought up to deal with conflict in an adult way. But co-founder conflict will happen in the same way that in a relationship conflict will happen. The question is, what can you do to equip yourself to deal with it? Friends and family, we put it out there because most of the time, people at some point start exhausting the patience of the people around them. Because there's only so many times you can hear somebody whinge about, oh, struggling to raise, oh, I'm dealing with this. But you need support network. But the problem is the more difficult it gets for somebody to deal with the pressures of the startup life, the more likely they are to also isolate themselves because the brain goes into, oh, I need to focus on the business. I don't have time for going to the cinema. I don't have time. I know it's my wedding anniversary, and all these things. Media, and I know we have media here, part of the pressures are the glorification of an image that we all know is actually not real. But guess what? We still get excited when we hear somebody raised X million on TechCrunch. We still read all these things that are being shown as success stories. But the reality is that it's just a tiny little glimpse, and we're just very, very good at ignoring the fact that we're very unlikely to do the same thing. And that leads into the last one is, of course, when we see this and we know the people, we go, oh, why did they manage to raise? I need to be able to keep up. And all this feeds into this big bucket. There's a lot of dots, as you can see in my presentation, because this is not exhaustive. This is just a glimpse of some of these triggers. On the other side, all these things have an effect. Imposter syndrome is something we hear a lot. I'm not the right person. I will be found out one day. Loneliness, every single founder I've spoken to, when they talk about the mental health struggles, they talk about how lonely it is, not being able to share, not being able to talk to your co-founders, your peers, your investors, your family. My co-founder in my current startup, he walked away from his old business because his physical health was ruined, and that affected his mental health. And he talks about experiencing guilt for letting the site down, and shame for not being well. Imagine going through life and you waste all your life building something, and when it doesn't succeed, rather than going, okay, fine, it is what it is, but I had to look after myself, you carry all this burden with you. Relationships, burnout, depression, anxiety. The list is really long. I'm going to talk a little bit about identity because yesterday we had a live podcast recording with one of my panelists, but identity came up. It's something that comes up all the time. One of the things that is also quite specific to the entrepreneurial experience is that your personal identity and your business identity merge into one. When I walked away from my business in 2018, I had therapy before, and I decided I'm going to start seeing a therapist to prepare myself for the grief that I expected to experience by no longer having my clear identity, which is I'm starter bootcamp. And then my dad died on my last day at work, and suddenly I was dealing with grief on different levels, and guess what? It's been a roller coaster. Depression is very common. Depression is something that a lot of people experience, but usually you kind of go, nah, depression is something that people go into hospitals for. Depression is something that people take drugs for. I'm fine. But even not being able to get out of bed for an hour every day, which happens for a lot of people, is a sign of depression. So there's a lot of different things that fall in depression. I just wanted to mention it briefly. I'm going to bring up a slide now with some of the things that we've seen that people shared with us that works. But again, very important to say that it's not exhaustive. People talk a lot about how therapy have helped them. Talking to somebody, talking to a specialist, talking to a non-judgmental person. Physical exercise comes through in every conversation. And it doesn't have to be being a super athlete. It's sometimes just going for a walk, being in nature. Some people find mindfulness helpful. Some people find journaling helpful. People talk about balanced nutrition because when you're busy and everything is around the business, then you usually neglect the healthy eating and you eat your carbs because it makes you feel good and all that. Same for sleep. And peer conversations. The one thing that we hear a lot is, I have nobody to talk to, I cannot share with anyone. Again, it's a long list. You in the room, if you're going through something, I'm sure you'll find your own. We found a simple way to summarize the 3 things that we think is how you need to look at this. You cannot address anything without figuring out what's going on. So self-inquiry matters. Finding out, what does it mean when I have this particular behavior? Observing yourself. And one of the things we ask the people that come on our podcast is, what were the signals you ignored that looking back you should have listened to not burn out, to not get to the state that you got? For those of you who are into rap music, Ice Cube has a song where he says, check yourself before you wreck yourself. It is the most short, simple way to remember that this really, really applies. Small steps is the next one. Small steps is super important because as entrepreneurs, we want a quick fix, we want it to work immediately, and also we want to boil the ocean on the best solution. But sometimes it's literally a question of going for a walk one day for 5 minutes and the next day adding a minute. Because sometimes that's all you can manage. And the last one is sharing. Every single person we've come across, and we're talking about hundreds of founders who shared with us their burnout stories, talk that if I had somebody to talk to, I might have not gone to the place that I ended up going to. And it could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be a confidant, it could be somebody close to you, or somebody completely neutral who we can have a judgment-free conversation with. I've overrun already. I mentioned our podcast, The Future Farm. We do 2 things. We invite founders to share their stories so other people can get inspired and learn from. The podcast is called Naked, because we invite people to strip down emotionally. Yesterday we found out that some people thought it's going to be a podcast in a sauna. Of course, this can only happen here. And all that said, I would like now to invite my panel to join me on the stage.